Okay, good morning everyone. We're on DAF Samech Dalet Amud Aleph, Mishnah. Nasa Isha v'shaha ima eser shanim v'lo yolda ina rashai levatel. If a man gets married and is childless for 10 years with this wife, he doesn't have a carte blanche to just absolve himself from the mitzvah of pru or vu. He's got to find a wife that can bear him children. So either he has to take a second wife, or divorce this wife and find another wife. But he's got to get remarried. Okay, so the question is this practiced widely today? One of the things we're going to see is the Gemara is going to tell us that if you live in Chutz La'aretz, this halacha bichlal doesn't apply, and that would explain, at least for partially, why we find great Gedalia Yisrael, like Lubavitcher Rabbi, who was married for his entire life without children and didn't observe this halacha of trying to procreate. But more than that, even in living in Eretz Yisrael, there's a Hagos Maimoni on the Rambam who says that one of the reasons why this halacha is not strictly adhered to Bisman Hazeh is that after the Churban, there's a medrash that says that Chazal wanted to be gozer, that people should no longer fulfill the mitzvah of pru or vu, just out of the great anguish of the loss of the temple. People felt there was no longer any purpose in procreation and continuing Klal Yisrael. But they said we can't do that because ein gozrin gzeira latzira elam ken yicholon lamod ba. We can't impose on the congregation a decree that they're not going to be able to abide by. So they didn't decree it, but the Hagos Maimoni says that based on that sentiment, at least, someone open the door for Samuel, please. Based on that sentiment, there's enough basis for a person to rely on that to not engage in procreation, if indeed he's at least married and is not able to have children. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. All right, so we're going to talk all about the different permutations as far as infertility in just a second, and Bob, we're going to consult with you shortly. Okay, so
I have to Google it.
So anyway, so girsha muteres linase la'acher. Now, if a man divorces his wife because she doesn't bear him children, she's allowed to remarry. It's not established definitively that the source of infertility is through her. So she's allowed to remarry, and v'rashaya sheni lishos ima yud shanim, and her second husband can also go through the 10-year period up until 10 years, and then it's done. Now, and then finally, the Mishnah says v'im hipila mona misha'a shehipila. If a woman miscarries, then you start the timer all over again. In other words, something very fascinating that we have to I don't really understand the svara, but the Mishnah says that infertility, as far as the 10-year waiting period, only counts as far as her inability to conceive. But let's say there are many women who have the ability to conceive. I should really have Esther Libman here, not Bob Libman. But there are plenty of women who are able to conceive, but they just can't. Their uterus can't carry the fetus. And that's the reason why they can't have children. The Mishnah says that's not a basis for divorcing your wife. If she shows that she's capable of conception, even if she's had multiple miscarriages, you start the timer all over again. Okay, and it's unclear to me. In other words, I guess that's not considered in the eyes of the Mishnah as a reason for definitive infertility. Now, Tana Rabbana, Nasa Isha v'sha'ima Esther Shanam v'lo yolda yotzi v'yitein ksuva. So we have, and the reason is Shema lo zacha lihibanos mimena. The Brisa says that if a man's married to a woman for 10 years and she doesn't bear him children, he has to divorce her, but she's entitled to her ksuva. Now, what does that tell you? When a woman is entitled to her ksuva, it's because she didn't do anything wrong to be the responsible for the exit of the marriage. And so the Brisa seems to be indicating that the man has to assume more blame for the lack of procreation than the woman. And we'll have to understand why that is. Because if she was at least equally to blame, then she would have to forfeit her ksuva.
Also, it's interesting lashon.
Right. He wasn't zoicha to have children from her. So the Gemara is going to ask, well, how come maybe she wasn't zoicha? So we'll have to understand that. So, and then the Brisa continues and it says, even though we can't prove this for sure from this pasuk, but at least this is what the pasuk indicates, that it says Miketz Eser Shanim L'Sheves Avram Be'eretz Canaan, that after 10 years that Avram lived in Eretz Canaan, his wife Sarah says to him, listen, we're not having kids, you better take Hagar and have kids from her. So, and we learn a second thing from that whole story, is L'Lamedcha She'en Yeshivat Chutz La'aretz Olalo Min HaMinyan. You see from here that living in Chutz La'aretz doesn't count. You're living in Chutz La'aretz, you don't have special Siyata Dishmaya. And that's the reason why you attribute it to that. It's only after, Avram and Sarah were married for many years before they made Aliyah. And it's only after they were living in Eretz Yisrael that the counter started. Lefichach, and now that you see that there are other mitigating circumstances that contribute to the childlessness of the couple, you can take those other mitigating circumstances into account as well. Lefichach chalohu o shecholsi o shneim chavushim beveis asurim ein olin lahen min aminyan. And therefore, if either the man is sick or the woman is sick for a certain period of time, or if they're in prison, so they're physically not able to be in touch with each other, so that's another reason that you don't count those as part of the 10 years. Let's say a man's in jail for a year out of the 10 years. That doesn't count as far as the timer because they're not able to have children then. Amalei Rav Rav Nachman v'leilaf mi Yitzchak d'chsiv v'yi Yitzchak ben 40 shana b'kachto es Rivke v'goymer v'chsiv Yitzchak ben 60 shana b'ledes osam. He says, I don't understand. You're learning from Avram that 10 years is the time limit. Why don't you learn from Yitzchak that 20 years is the time limit? Because after all, how old was Yitzchak when he married Rivka?
40.
And how old was he when they had a child? 60. So you see that maybe it's 20 years should be the time limit. Tosfos asks an interesting question. He says, I don't understand how you can even ask this question. How old was Rivka when Yitzchak married her? 3. We know that a girl can't even bear children until she's 12 years old. So it's going to work out to approximately 10 years anyway. Right? So Tosfos' answer is we're going according to the other opinion in the Midrash. Remember we learned before that there are different opinions. She was either 12 or 14. So according to that opinion, then this is a kasha. So we've already seen 2 Gemaras that tell us that Rivka was not 3 years old. So I wish that our kids would learn these Gemaras. I mean, the other parts of the Gemaras I don't want them to learn, right? But the parts of the Gemaras, this part of the Gemara, in other words, Rashi brings that she was 3. Fine, but for our children should at least know that that's only one opinion. Okay, so the question then is, so what about the fact that Yitzchak was married 20 years? So Amalei Yitzchak Akor Haya. So the answer is, as we'll see in just a minute, Yitzchak knew for sure that he was an akar, that he was infertile. He knew that he was incapable, at least temporarily, for the 20 years, not able to have children, and therefore there was no reason to divorce Rivka because he knew if he married someone else, he wouldn't be able to have a child with her also.
Weren't the Yevamos, they had the thing of being akara and then a
Yes, we're going to learn this today's Gemara. So Ihachi Avram Nami Akar Haya. So as we'll see shortly, Avram also. So if that's the case, then you can't learn from Avram either. So the Gemara says, Hahumi boy leilichid Rabchia bar Abba. So the Gemara says no. The difference is, and you have to sort of fill in the blank here, the difference between Avram and Yitzchak is that when the Torah tells us that there were 20 years that transpired between Yitzchak's marriage to Rivka and the time that Yaakov and Esav were born, is because of a different reason. However, why does as we'll see in just a minute, but why does the Torah tell us that it was 10 years that they were living in Eretz Yisrael without children? There seems to be no reason for that at all, unless it's to teach us the halacha that after 10 years you got to find another wife. But over here with Yitzchak, the reason why the Torah tells us that they were childless for 20 years is for another reason. The Amr B'chia bar Abba Amr Rabbi Yechanan Lama Nimnu Shnosav Shel Yishmael Kedei Liyaches Man Shnosav Shel Yaakov. And the answer is because there are many times, and the Torah will tell you how much time has elapsed in order to tell you what was happening in the life of another patriarch. For example, we know that Yishmael's lifespan is listed. He dies at 137 years. Why does the Torah have to tell me how long Yishmael lived? So Chazal asked this question. They tell us, is to tell us where Yaakov Avinu was at different stages of his life. Now, how does that tie into Yaakov? Because we know that Yishmael was 14 years older than Yitzchak. Okay, because Yishmael was 14 when Yitzchak was born. We also know that Yitzchak was 60 when Yaakov was born. So that means that Yishmael was 74. When we count when Yishmael died, and we know that shortly after a series of events happened with Yaakov Avinu, so then we can know how old Yaakov was when all of these events occurred. That's what Chazal tell us. And therefore, the reason why we need to know that Yitzchak was 60 when Yaakov was born is not to tell us that because he went 20 years, but rather to note how old Yaakov would be when other things happened to him in his lifetime. Okay, fine. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Avinu Akur Hayas. And let's go back to this discussion of the Avos being sterile. That Yitzchak was sterile. Shenemar Vayatar Yitzchak Lashem Lenochach Ishto. That it says that Yitzchak supplicated to Hashem opposite his wife, or against his wife. So Al Ishto Lo Nemar Elo Lenochach. It doesn't say that he supplicated on behalf or for his wife, but rather opposite to his wife. So Melamed Sheshnei Makurim Hayu means that he was praying opposite her, meaning that he knew that he was also a source of infertility. So Ihachi Vayi Aser Lo Vayetar Lahemi Boile. So then why does the Torah say that God only responded to Yitzchak? It should say God responded to both of them by granting them both the gift of fertility, if both of them were infertile. So the Gemara says, the answer is that you're right. Really, Hashem created a miracle for both Rivke and for Yitzchak to give them the gift of fertility. But when it talks about God responding, God only responded to the prayers of Yitzchak, even though Rivka also had prayed, because God is more responsive to the prayers of a tzaddik ben tzaddik, the child of a tzaddik, more so than the prayers of a tzaddik, the son of a wicked person. And since Rivka's father was wicked, Hashem was not as responsive to her prayers. Rav Dessler has an interesting essay on this. He says, if anything, I would think that a tzaddik ben Rasha should be even on a higher level, because they're like a Baal Tshuva, Yeah, right. In other words, look, they were able to break free of... so he has a very interesting insight. There's maybe other explanations. His insight is that it's much harder to be a tzaddik ben than a tzaddik ben Rasha. He says, because if your father's a tzaddik, how do you break away from their shadow and become your own tzaddik? That's a much harder avoda than being a tzaddik ben Rasha, right? So anyway, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak mipnei ma hayu avosenu akurim mipnei shakadosh baruch hu misavel tfilasan shel tzadikim. Why were our ancestors infertile? Right, Avram was fertile, and his wife Sarah, Yitzchak, and Rivka were infertile, Rachel, etc. The answer is because Hashem loves the prayers of the righteous, and when they go through different trials and tribulations in their lives, they cry out in agony to Hashem, and Hashem loves that, to hear their prayers, that bonding, and eventually He answers those prayers. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, lama nimshal tfilasim shel tzadikim ka'atar. Why are the prayers of the righteous like a pitchfork? Ma'atar zeh mahapech hatfu mimakom lamakom, kach tfilasim shel tzadikim mahapechas mitosav shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu mibidas ragzanus lamidas rachmanus. Because just like a pitchfork turns over the sheaves of wheat from one side to the other, so too the prayers of the righteous overturn Hashem's attributes from wrath to compassion and mercy. Amar Rabbi Ami Avram v'Sara tumtamin hayu. This is a very bold statement the Gemara makes. Not only were they infertile, but physiologically they didn't even have recognizable organs of reproduction. Because what is a tumtum? A tumtum is a person that you can't tell upon examination. There's a membrane blocking the organs to really clearly discern what gender they are. That Avram and Sarah both had that condition at one point in their lives. And how do you know this? Shenamar habitu el tzur chutzavtem vel makeves bor nukartem. That it says, the first pasuk in Yeshaya chapter 51 says, take a look at the rock who hewed you, and at the impression in the pit that was bored for you. And it seems like what the pasuk is describing euphemistically is that one party was given the gift of having a male organ, and the other party was given a gift of having a female organ. And who is this pasuk referring to? The next pasuk, Habitu el Avram avichem vel Sarah tochal alchem. That it says, take a look at Avram, your father, and the Sarah who gave birth to you. So you see that Avram and Sarah were granted the gift of finding their organs sometime later in life. Okay, Amar of Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, Sarah imenu islandess haisa. He says that she was an islandess, which means that she didn't have physiological hormonal maturity, because Shenamar Vatihi Sarai Akara Ein La Valad Afilu Beis Valad Ein La, that the Torah says that Sarai was infertile, she had no child. Isn't that redundant? Right? So what is the words Ein La Valad? She wasn't even capable of having a child because she had no uterus. And that was part of the miracles that HaKadosh Baruch Hu miraculously created a uterus for her. Amar Rav Yehuda Bereder Rav Shmuel Bar Shilas Mishmei Darav Lo Shano Ela Bedaros Harishon Shishnoseim Merubos Although Bedaros Achron Shishnoseim Muatos Shtei Shanu Mechza Keneged Shlosha Iburim. He says this law of a 10-year waiting period, and then you got to find another wife after 10 years, that was only in earlier times when people lived longer. Today, when people live so much shorter, we only give you like a little bit less than 2.5 years. If you don't have a wife, if you don't have a child from your wife after 27 months, which is 3 pregnancy cycles, then you got to move on. Life's too short, man. Chick-chock, let's go. On to the next one. Right? That's what the Gemara seems to be saying. So Rabba Amar Rav Nachman Shalosh Shanim Keneged Shalosh Bekidos. And Rav Nachman says, no, it's not, not 2.5 years. It's actually 3 Rosh Hashanah cycles. You have to go through 3 Rosh Hashanahs in order to be able to determine that it's time to move on to the next one. Why? Because there were 3 women who were visited by God with the blessing of childbirth on Rosh Hashanah. That these great matriarchs, Sarah, Rachel, and Chana, were granted the gift. So therefore, since we have 3 examples, that's a clue that you can go through 3 cycles of Rosh Hashanah, and only then do you have a right to move on to the next one. Amar Rabba Lesnu Lani Klali Mechdi Masnisin Mantakin Rebbe B'Habimei David Imot Shnei. He says, no, I disagree with those statements, the last 2 statements. That's not true. What are you telling me? Because people live shorter lifespans still, you got to move on more quickly? How can you say that? When did Rebbe write the mission of 10 years? He wrote it in his lifetime. So you tell me what, in Rebbe's generation, people lived longer than we live today? Already back in the day of David HaMelech, people were only living 70 years, which is the lifespan of today. So therefore, if already in David HaMelech's time people's lifespans were shortened, then surely that's true in Rabbi Yehuda Anasi's time when he wrote the Mishnah. So therefore, lifespans have not changed that dramatically, right? It's not like it's such an urgent thing that you gotta give a person only 2 or 3 years. As Shlomi was saying is like, what does it mean that only he was not zoiche, and that's why she's entitled to her ksufa? This is the Gemara's question. Why are you automatically assuming that it's the man's fault that he wasn't zoiche to have a child, and that's why she gets her ksufa? Maybe it's just the opposite. Maybe she wasn't zoiche. So why don't you say normally, like we say, hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, that she wants to get the money. Let her prove that it's her fault, that it's his fault, and not her fault. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Kevin de lo mifkada apriya uravia lo mi ansha. If you look at childlessness as a punishment from Hashem, then the punishment is not for her, it's for the man. Because he's the one who has the mitzvah of pru'urvu, of procreation. So therefore, if they don't have children together, it must be that there's something wrong. There's a greater indication, shall we say, that there's something wrong with him more than there's something wrong with her. Whether it's physical or metaphysical, the Gemara is not making that distinction. So the Gemara says, Eini, is this really so? V'hamr le Rabbanu le Rabbi Abba bar Zavdin nesiv itza v'olid b'ni v'amr lehu izakai havalumi kamaisa. But what about the story? The Gemara says that the rabbis, they noticed that Rabbi Abba was not getting remarried after his first wife either died or he divorced her. And they said, Rabbi Abba, you got to, get another wife because you got to fulfill the mitzvah of pru'urvu. And he said, nah, I don't need to fulfill the mitzvah. Listen, if I would have been roy to fulfill the mitzvah, I would have already had children with my first wife. So the Gemara is now asking the question, how can the Mishnah tell me that, okay, fine, maybe you weren't zocha to have children from the first wife, maybe you'll be zocha to have children from the second wife. You see that Rabbi Abba said, if I wasn't zocha from the first wife, it's already game over. Like, how did he know that? So the Gemara says, Hasam dichoy komad chilu l'Rabbanan, the Rabbi Abba bar Zavda, iakar mi pirkei de Rav Huna. The Gemara says, really Rabbi Abba was not giving them a serious answer. Because the truth is, just because you weren't zocha to have children with one wife doesn't mean that you won't be zocha with another wife. However, why did he tell him that? He didn't want to give him the real answer. The real answer was that he was sterile. And he knew that he was sterile because he was one of those famous Talmidim of Rav Huna. Remember, learned about Rav Sheshis a few days ago? That Rav Sheshis also was rendered sterile because he used to sit in Rav Huna's shir. He didn't have the chutzpah to get up in the middle of the shir, and Rav Huna would lecture for hours on end. And as a result of having this full bladder for hours at a time on a continual basis, it eventually rendered him sterile. Bob, are you aware of such a condition? Okay. All right. Rav Gidel iyakar mepirkei de Rav Huna, Rabbi Chelbo iyakar mepirkei de Rav Huna, Rav Sheshis iyakar mepirkei de Rav Huna. Look at all of these great sages who Nebuch became sterile as a result of being in Rav Huna's shir. So Rav Acha bar Yaakov achadete suskinta tal yuha ba'arza devei Rav v'nafak minei kuhutza yarka. Now Rav Acha bar Yaakov was once taken over by the illness called suskinta, which is a certain kind of, probably like some kind of urinary tract infection or some other kind of illness having to do with the urinary tract. And what he did was they hung him up on a tree outside the yeshiva, or he hanged himself on a tree. And by doing this kind of physical manipulation, somehow a discharge came out of him that was bright green, and as a result, now some say that this was caused him to be cured. It's not that, it doesn't say that explicitly in the Gemara, but or either that or it's a manifestation of the illness. It's really not clear. But someone was telling me that in the art scroll they translated as that this is what cured him. In other words, after he had this discharge, which was creating that urinary blockage, or what is it? The Van's deferens, the vas deferens, the thing that connects the testes to the urethra. So that perhaps was blocked, and that's what caused the blockage. I'm not sure. Anyway, Amar Ravacha bar Yaakov Shisin Sabi Havina V'Kulu Yakar Mipirkei de Ravuna LeBar Me'ana T'Kaimi B'Nafshay Achacham Etachayez Be'aleha. So Ravacha bar Yaakov says there were 60 sages who all became sterile as a result of being in Rav Huna's shir, except for me. Like I did this kind of remedy and had this discharge, and I guess it unblocked the blockage that was a result of a continued full bladder, and therefore I was cured from my of my sterility, and I was able to continue having children. And I fulfilled in myself that wisdom will give life to its owner. Okay, next go on. Girsha muteris v'chulei. The Mishnah had said that if a man is married 10 years, no kids, divorces his wife, the woman is allowed to remarry. It's not proven that she's the source of the infertility. But then the Mishnah doesn't go on and tell us, and what if the second guy waits with her 10 years, what then? Like it doesn't tell us what the next chapter of her life is. It seems like from the Mishnah that's it. She can only marry a second husband. And that's the Gemara's diak, sheni in, shlishi lo. It seems like after being married to two husbands for 10 years each and not having kids, she's demonstrated a pattern, a chazaka, that she's not going to have children. So masnisin money, Rebbe, the Tanya, mala harishon umeis, sheni umeis, shlishi lo timol, divrei Rebbe. The Mishnah goes like Rebbe, because Rebbe is recorded as saying that if a woman has a child, gives him a bris, and he dies, presumably it's because of hemophilia, then she has a second child, gives him a bris, and he dies, then the third child she should not mal. In other words, after 2 times, you've established a pattern. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel oimer, shlishi timol, revi lo timol. That Rabbi Shimon Gamliel disagrees. He says, no, you only establish a pattern with 3 times. So therefore, if the third child is born, she should give him a bris. And only if the third child dies, then she should not circumcise the 4th child. So this is a machlokas between Rebbe and Shimon Gamliel. Rebbe says 2 times establishes a pattern, just like in our Mishnah, that 2 times of being married with bearing no children establishes a pattern. And Shimon Gamliel says, no, you need 3 times. So frak the Gemara v'hatanya ibcha. But don't we have a brisa that says that no, Rebbe says 3 and Rosh Hashanah Gamliel says 2? So the Gemara says, Heminayu achranisa. Which brisa comes later? It will be the more authoritative brisa. So Tashma, Damar Reb Chia bar Abba, Amar Rav Yechanan, Maisa be'arba achayas be'tzipori shemala rishana v'amei shniya v'amei shlishis u'meis revias b'oslafei Reb Shimon Gamliel, Amar la al tamuli. So the Gemara quotes a story that Rabbi Yochanan testifies about Reb Shimon Gamliel. Now, if Rabbi Yochanan is testifying about Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, then this brisa must have happened towards the end of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's life. And that's how we know that this is the most authoritative story. And what does the story tell us? That a woman there were three sisters. There were four sisters in the city of Tzipori. The first one had a child, and after bris, the child died. Second had a child, same thing. Third, same thing. The fourth sister brings her newborn child to Rishon Gamliel and says, the bris is supposed to be tomorrow, what should I do? He tells her, don't do the bris. So you see that Rishon Gamliel is the one who holds 3 times, establishes the chazaka. Bedilma I asya shlishis nami hava amar la. So the Gemara says, that's not a raya. Maybe if the third sister had come to him, he would have told her the same thing. So the Gemara says, Im kain mai ashadu say the Rabbi Chia bar Abba. But if that were the case, then what is Rabbi Chia bar Abba providing us with information if there's no halachic import to it? Right? Because even if the third one would have come, he would have said the same thing. So the Gemara says, no. Maybe there is halachic import, because v'dilma yis hakamashmalon the achayos mechazikos. That maybe what Rabbi Chia bar was, he wasn't coming to tell me how many times establishes a chazaka. Maybe he was coming to teach that sisters can establish a chazaka, which means, in other words, the only thing that we've seen up until now is that if one woman displays a genetic predisposition towards hemophilia by having multiple children with hemophilia, then you don't then you don't do the bris on the newborn. How do you know that if one sister displays it and another sister displays it, that by the third or fourth sister you also have to be chayr? How do you know that the genetics transfers laterally to sisters? That's something that Rabbi Chia bar Abba was coming to speak about, and therefore we don't have a raya from here.
Why are we assuming that a later brisa is more authoritative? Sorry, that a later brisa is more authoritative than an earlier brisa?
Because we would assume that corrections are made in a later brisa.
But usually we think of things that are closer to the see
That's true. That's true if it's a question of something that's corrupted at a later time. But here the Gemara is saying that when we have a chain of transmission, whatever comes later in the transmission of a certain era is going to correct the mistakes of the past. So if you feel that there's you're right, Bob's raising a very important point. If you feel that corruption has crept into a girsa, so then you would go with the earlier edition. But if you know that there's been no corruption, but you know that there's 2 different opinions, then you wait to see until the dust settles and you see which opinion prevails. So Amar Rava, Hashta de Amart Achayos Mechazikos Lo Yisa Adam Isha Lomi Mishpachas Nichbin Velomi Mishpachas Mitzorayim. He says, now that we know that one sister can help establish a chazaka for another sister, in other words, it can run in the family, really the Gemara is talking about something that we all know about today, about genetics, right? The Gemara says a person should not marry a woman if in her family there's a certain illness called nichbin, which I think they translate as epilepsy, right? Or another thing, it's don't marry a woman if there are mitzorayim, if people have tsaras in her family. But that's provided that there are 3 people who have the same illness in her family. Anything less than that could be a coincidence. So my haviyala, and by the way, you have to know how much weight to put on this, right? In other words, what determines whether you break the shidduch or not. So my haviyala, what was the final upshot about whether 2 times establishes a chazaka or 3 times? So Kiyasa Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef. So remember, this is being said by Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef. Okay, so that's going to be relevant. So Amar Uvda Hava Kamei de Rabbi Yochanan b'Chanishna Demaon b'Yom HaKippur Shechalios b'Shabbos Umala Rishana Umei Shni Umei Shlishas Balafanav Armala Lachi Umuli. So there was once a story like this. He's citing Rabbi Yochanan, the earlier Amora, and he says that there was once a situation where a woman lost her first 2 children to hemophilia because of their bris. And by the 3rd child, the bris was supposed to be on Yom Kippur that fell out on Shabbos. She asked Rabbi Yochanan, what should I do? And Rabbi Yochanan said, go ahead, you can still mal the child. And the reason is because Rabbi Yochanan felt that you need 3 times to establish the chazaka, 2 times is not enough. So Amar le Abaye, Chazid de Kasharis Isura v'Sakanta. But Abaye challenges Rabbi Yitzchak and he says, based on your account of what Rabbi Yochanan paskined, but what if Rabbi Yochanan was wrong? What if only 2 times establishes a chazaka? Then look what would be happening. Not only is he causing the child to die by putting the child in danger, but he's also allowing a woman to violate Yom Kippur and Shabbos, because if really the bris is not supposed to take place, and he's paskening to do the bris on Yom Kippur that falls out on Shabbos, it's a mamisha, both sakana and isser that he's in violation of. But nevertheless, even though Abaye challenged Rabbi Yitzchak, in what he said, but when it came to his own personal life, Samach Allah Abaya, Va'azal Naspa Lechoma Barata De'isi Bereda Rav Yitzchak Bereda Rav Yehuda, he nevertheless married a very beautiful woman. Her name was Choma, and tells you her lineage. And the Naspa Rachba de Pumpadisa V'Shachav Rav Yitzchak Bereda Rabba Bar Chana V'Shachav, and she had previously been married to two great sages. The Gemara elsewhere tells us that Abaya was enchanted by Choma's beauty when she came to Beis Din at one point, and it was on that basis that he married her. V'Naspa Hu V'Shachiv, and he married her, and guess what happened? He died, right? In other words, so Choma really was what we call a katlanis. She was a woman who, what we call a black widow. No, today we call a black widow as a woman who actually kills her husbands deliberately. It's not that we're accusing Choma of being a murderer, but she had this power to cause her husbands to die. And we'll explain more about this in a moment. Amar Rava, Umika David Uvda Benafshe Kihai. So Rava's questioning, he says, Rava is Abaye's chavrusa. He says, how could Abaye have done such a thing? To rely on the fact that 2 times does not establish a chazak, and on that basis I'll marry Choma. He says, but he himself, Abaye himself knew that what he was doing was wrong, because v'ha'iu da'amar abin de samcha yitzchak sumka lav bar samcha abin yeshno b'chazara yitzchak sumka eno b'chazara. He says that Abin, one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan, was a reliable reporter of Rabbi Yochanan's psak. And Yitzchak Sumka, Yitzchak the Red, presumably is the same Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, was not reliable. He said that Abin would have said every single shir that Rabbi Yochanan gave, and on that basis, even if Rabbi Yochanan would have retracted at one point, you could be sure that Abin would have heard Rabbi Yochanan retract. But Rabbi Yitzchak was not at every shir, so he might have heard Rabbi Yochanan say one thing one day, and didn't hear him be choser, didn't hear him retracted on the other day, and therefore you can't rely on what Rabbi Yitzchak tells you. Not that he's lying, but because he might have heard Rabbi Yochanan one day and didn't hear Rabbi Yochanan correct himself the next day. So how could Abaye have relied on that? Va'od, and furthermore, Amar de pligi le'inyan mila b'nison mi pligi. And just because they argue when it comes to bris milah, what establishes a pattern, what establishes a chazaka, why would you say that how can you extrapolate that and apply that to laws of marriage as well? But the Gemara says but that second challenge that Rabbi presents is not a problem, because yes, you can't, because v'hatanya, look at the brisa. Niseis l'rishon umeis, l'sheni umeis, l'shlishi lo tinasi, divrei Rabbi, Rishon Gamliel omer, l'shlishi tinasi, l'revi lo tinasi. You have the exact same machlokas when it comes to marriage. A man, if a woman marries her first husband and he dies, second husband and he dies, according to Rabbi, she's not allowed to marry a third husband because she's already established a pattern of a katlanis. And Rav Shimon Gamliel says, no, she can marry a third husband. It's the fourth husband she can't marry. So Bishlam Agabe Mila Ika Mishpacha de Rafi Dama, Vika Mishpacha de Kamit Dama, Elanisu in my time. So the Gemara is not going to ask. He said, explain the mechanism to me. I can understand establishing a pattern of hemophilia in a family. That makes very good sense. There are certain families that don't have clotting factors in their blood. And that's why, if after having multiple children that have hemophilia, don't do the bris, because they've already established a pattern in the family. But how does it work that a woman kills her husbands if she's not intentionally killing them? What koach exists within a woman to kill her husband? So Amalei Rav Mordechai Ravashi Hacha Amar Avim Hagrunia Mishmei de Rav Huna Mayan Gorein. And he says, and Bob, here you may have to check with your wife, he says there's potentially something in a woman's uterus that could contain something infectious to a husband that could kill him. So, I don't know if there is such a condition.
Are they saying it's gynecologically transmitted?
It's gynecologically transmitted. That's what they're saying. Mayan Goreim. Is it chlamydia? Is it venereal disease? Is it something that she may transmit to her husband that could kill him? And Ravashi Amar Mazel Goreim. And Rav Ashi says, no, it's got nothing to do with gynecology. It's a metaphysical thing, that her mazel can cause a husband to die. So my benayu, what's the difference whether you hold that it's physical or metaphysical? So ika benayu di irsa umis inami dinafel midikla umis. He says, what if a man never consummated with his wife and then he dies? Then you know that it's got nothing to do with gynecology. Or if, let's say, he fell off a tree and he died, and the woman has multiple husbands who have these accidents, then you also know it's got nothing to do with the physical contact. It's got to do with some kind of mazel. Amalei Rav Yosef berei de Rava l'Rava be'imi name Rav Yosef halacha karebi va'amar li in. Halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel v'amar li in. Achuchi achich bi. So Rav Yosef, Bar Yosef says to Rava, Rava, I asked Rav Yosef, I asked him, is the halacha like Rabbi? And he said yes. And later I asked him, is the halacha like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel? And he said yes. I think he's making fun of me. So Amar Le, no. So Rava said to him, no, Rav Yosef's not making fun of you. Lo, stamihi, upashalach nisunu malkios karebi, vestos v'sharamuad karab Shimon Gamliel. He says, no, we have different mishnayos, and in some mishnayos they paskin like Rebbe, and some mishnayos they paskin like Shimon Gamliel, depending on the halacha. In other words, what you see from here is that it's not across the board. The establishment of the chazaka is always 2 or always 3. It depends on the halachic situation. When it comes to marriage and when it comes to malchus, you establish a pattern with 2 times. When it comes to vestos, which is establishing a menstrual pattern or establishing whether an animal is a gorer, that you require 3 times. And where do we see this? Nisuan hada amr. When it comes to marriage, we've just established that Choma was a katlanis after only 2 times, so that establishes a pattern. And our Mishnah also had said that if she's gone through 2 cycles of 10 years, that's it, game over. So it's 2 times. And Malkios, and what about Malkus? Ditnan mishalaka v'shana based in konsonoso lekipa machilinoso saorin achete kreisen ifkaas. That let's say you're dealing in a time in Jewish history when Beis Din no longer administers the capital punishment. So in that situation, or perhaps this is not, a guy does a habitual offense for which the penalty is not the death penalty. So the Beis Din can't actually put him to death. So, but let's say a guy has this uncontrollable desire for bacon, right? And so he's eating bacon all over town. Finally, 2 witnesses come over and say, you can't eat bacon. And he just ignores them. So they take him to Beis Din, they give him malchus. They say, better not do this again. But then the very next day, he's out going to Bacon City and he's eating bacon, right? So what do we do with him in that situation? He's already established himself as a habitual snubber of the Beis Din, and this is grounds for us to eliminate him. We can't eliminate him outright by putting him to death because he's not chayiv misa. So what we do is bring him in a barn, feed him lots of barley that'll eventually burst his belly, and that's how he'll die. So more to be said about that particular method, but bottom line is, don't mess with the Beis Din. Okay?
Give him more bacon.
And vestos, and what's the halacha about vestos? You need 3 to establish a pattern. That non eino isha kovas laveses ashetik ba'ena shalosh pa'amim vein metaheres min aveses ashetik mimena shalosh pa'amim. That we know that in order for a woman to establish a pattern, let's say she menstruates always on the 6th day of the month, for example, right? So in order to establish that pattern, she needs to go through 3 cycles where she establishes that pattern 3 times. 2 times is not enough. And also, to be able to break that pattern, she has to go through 3 months where she doesn't have her period on the 6th of the month. And this has halachic ramifications as far as whether a woman has a vesis kavua or a vesis she'eno kavua, which we won't get into now. And finally, when it comes to shor hamuad, when it comes to establishing whether an animal is a goring animal, as far as liability for full payment, it has to gore 3 times in order to be fully liable. And there also you need to have a pattern of 3 times. 2 times is not sufficient. So you see, sometimes we say 2 and sometimes we say 3. Have a wonderful day.